So we're going to talk about Gestalt therapy, but before that I want you to take a look at this picture. And what you see. Your eyes will see two triangles, one of which is not actually there, it's just dots. But our brain replaces the information. Take a look at this as well. Some people looking at it might see two people about to kiss. Others might see a vase or a wine goblet. You can look at the vase and focus on that, or you can look at the two people, but you're unable to see both at once. That's called figure and ground. And that is one of the main things that we're going to talk about in terms of this particular theory. This is the same thing. Some of you might see a woman. Others might see a person playing a saxophone. But you're not able to see both at the same time. You have to either see one or the other. And in this last picture, it's a colored picture, so it's a little bit different than the others. You can see some rocks with some snow, or you can see horses. So Gestalt therapy talks about figure and ground, and we're going to talk a little bit about that as we go through. Those are what we're going to be talking about. But before we do that, I need to discuss the differences between Gestalt therapy and Gestalt psychology. Gestalt psychology is different. It is more of a learning theory in terms of its focus than Gestalt therapy. So Gestalt psychology was founded by Max Wertheimer, and it was based on observation that we experience things that are not part of our simple sensations. We see things that are not there, as in that first picture, or with the picture of the vase, right? We have a tendency to perceive one aspect of an event as the figure or foreground, and the other is the ground or background. With one image, but there's two different things you can see, and you can only focus on one. Now, Fritz Perls took this and used it in his theory in a different way, okay? But for Gestalt psychology, it's about learning. We learn the literal things in front of us and the relationships between those things. And that's what helps us fill in the gaps in these pictures. They talk about insight learning, which is solving a problem by means of the recognition of a gestalt or organizing principle. So, for example, in case conceptualizations, we use the knowledge about the theory in relation to the person or the case, and that is also interacted with everyone's individual view of the world and their own life experiences. So we fill in the gaps or add our own experiences to it, and everyone's is going to be a little bit different. They also talk about isomorphism, which means sameness in form. It's used in mathematics, and basically what it means is two forms that are very similar. So if you look at the clock tower at University Hall and you look at your watch, they are essentially the same thing. One is much larger, but the inner workings are basically the same. Their mechanisms are isomorphic. Okay? The big gap between the theory and the psychology has to do with the way of learning. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in just a second. But like I said, the Gestalt is about seeing what is not there. And it's much more interested in learning. And Gestalt therapy is much more interested in actually feeling and self-awareness. That's a little bit different. So Fritz Perls talked about self-awareness. understanding who you are, who your true self is, and also being aware of your environment and your interactions. And this awareness comes in terms of the 5 senses, your bodily sensations, and your emotional feelings. This is primarily an affective approach, where you talk about emotions in the here and now. It's existential in the sense that it emphasizes the responsibility of the individual. It's phenomenological in the sense that it values human experience. Okay? The idea is that people split off from their experiences, thoughts, sensations, and emotions that are uncomfortable. So that part of self splits off. And that splitting off creates a fragmentation of the personality. Fritz Perls' focus was to assist people in owning their experiences in the here and now and developing a healthy Gestalt or wholeness, which is what Gestalt means in German. So some important people are Fritz Perls himself, Laura, his wife, and then there are a variety of people that have helped him along the way, but also have been very influential in the continuing of Gestalt therapy. So let's talk about the beginning, right? He was born Frederick Solomon Perls in Germany in 1893, and there are parts of his journals online, and if you read them, they say things like, and this is a quote, loving the arts, hating father, father hating mother, loving women. His mother was very loving, but she was ambitious. His parents did not get along at all. And his father apparently enjoyed being with other women. He was happy, and in public his parents seemed to get along, so both friendly in public confusing, which confused him. So immediately a lot of his experiences is what was being shown was phony and what was happening was not. And those are Fritzy and his brother and sister there. He loved poetry, the arts, and theater. His uncle kept trying to have him become a lawyer, and he resisted that. He didn't want to be a psychologist, though, because the way they worked at the time didn't make sense to them. There's much more intermingling now between psychologists and counseling and psychiatrists in how we think, but the way that they were focused did not help him. He didn't understand it. So he begins to read Freud, and realizes that to become a psychoanalyst, he has to go, at that time, had to be a medical doctor. So he became a doctor, and he was ridiculed. Because remember, doctor was not the profession that it is today, medical doctor. But he did graduate medical school, and he studied psychoanalysis. He said he felt stupid talking to a couch. Because remember, all people that become psychoanalysts have to be on the other side of that, right? And so that's when he started kind of working away and becoming his own person in psychoanalysis. He said he often felt depressed. I think some of that was because he just didn't get what he was doing. It didn't make sense to him. In 1930, he married Laurie Posner, became Laura. Posner became Laura Posner Fritz. They had 2 children, a boy and a girl, and 4 grandkids. In 1933, with their oldest, who is a boy, they fled Germany. They started off in the Netherlands. Then a year later, they moved to South Africa. In 1936, Freud and Fritz had some issues. But in 1936, the paper was rejected by the Freudians that he wrote. And he actually, what was really interesting is that he spent a significant amount of time trying to get, I mean, think about where he was, and at the time, from South Africa to Germany to deliver this paper. And he did that and was able to get an audience with Freud. So he traveled, he had to borrow a private yacht, somebody's private yacht. He traveled 4,000 miles to sit down and have a conversation with Freud. And he basically said something like, well, it's small talk, right? They're sitting down together, and he says, well, I traveled 4,000 miles to be here. And Freud kind of sits back, closes his eyes, and says, "When are you leaving?" And I think that, between the fact that his paper was rejected by the Freudians, made him so angry that he chose, at that point, he realized that he was going to move away from them, although he didn't officially for much later. Between 1937 and 1940, he studied with Kurt Goldstein, who was a Gestalt psychologist, by the way, who worked with soldiers who had brain injuries. He actually worked as an assistant, and also read some of Smuts, who I'm going to explain to you in a minute, and determined that their neurotic is a person who is blind to the obvious. If you go back and read some of Fritz's journals on the rejection of the paper, he says things like, oral resistances rejected. Resistances are always anal. And he goes on to talk about how he knows better, but sure he can't know better. It's almost like he's in an argument with himself. In 1941, he published a book called Hunger and Aggression. It had very good reviews, but slow sales. His wife actually wrote a couple of chapters in the book, and has not been given credit for that. He presented the book to Maria Bonaparte, who was actually a friend of Freud, in 1942. And I guess she had Freud read it, and Freud basically asked Fritz to resign from the Psychoanalytic Society if he doesn't believe in libido. So at that point is when the official break occurs. In 1942, he joins the South African Army as a psychiatrist and begins to really work on his theory during that time. When he is discharged, he moves his family to New York. They republish the book Hunger and Aggression, but it doesn't really go anywhere. In 1947, he published Gestalt Therapy. That book he actually had people help with. There are several other people that went in and helped clarify his writings. And if you go back and look at his journals, you'll understand why. His journals are very... I'm sure they make sense to him, and if you just read it, it's definitely just a flow of thought. So he probably needed the help to get it cleared up. It actually got pretty good reviews and helped launch the New York Institute for Gestalt Therapy that they actually started. I have different years, 1951, 1952, but it started in their apartment, probably in 1951, and then officially opened an office in 1952. But it depends on who you read as to what the dates are. In 1951, he published an article with Paul Goodman, Ralph Hefferlein. You don't need to know their names, but you do need to know that Ralph was a university professor and a former client, or sometimes still a client, of Pearl's. So the boundaries there for Pearl's were a little odd. They used this article to push the workshops to inform the workshops, and then that helped Gestalt therapy grow. And in 1955, he opened the Gestalt Institute of Cleveland. So just showing you the progress there. In 1960, he had his first Gestalt training in Esalen Institute in California, and what was really interesting is that this was a place where all the brains kind of went. You know, Carl Rogers visited there a few times. There were a lot of lectures there, and in fact, Gloria's daughter Pammy lived there, and Gloria visited there a few times. In 1964, he joins the Institute officially, and really begins to work there permanently, or on a long-term basis anyway. In 1969, he decides to move to Vancouver Island and organized a Gestalt community there. So he moved a lot, and he was continuously moving. When he originally, in 1960, went to California, he went without his wife. She stayed in New York. And I'm not sure at what point that she joined him. I haven't been able to find that. He died March 14th, 1970, of heart failure in Chicago. He was in a hospital in Chicago. So again, on the move. His Gestalt prayer: I do my thing and you do your thing. I am not in this world to live up to your expectations, and you are not in this world to live up to mine. You are you, and I am I, and if by chance we find each other, it's beautiful. If not, it can't be helped. And on Blackboard is a link to a YouTube video that has about 8 minutes of Pearls talking in a group setting about this prayer. So there were some specific people that influenced Fritz. That Kurt Goldstein that we talked about. He talked about an organism as a whole, right? He was the one that worked with brain injured soldiers. That really helped Fritz think about a person in a holistic way, the environment and who they are themselves. And so I think that was really helpful for him. Sigmund Freelander had concepts of differential thinking and creative indifference. He basically had the idea that opposites define each other and that there is a resting point in the middle. These opposites become really important later on in the experiments. And Jan Smuts was a prime minister of South Africa, and where Fritz obviously and his family fled. He wrote a book on holism and evolution that examined the ecological world from Gestalt psychology perspective. He is the one that coined the term holism. Kurt Goldstein talked about organism as a whole, but Smuts actually talked about holism, and he and Fritzie would have long conversations together. Alfred Korzybski basically helped him think about people in terms of how they approach the world. And Alfred really believed that people should approach the world in an I don't know, let's see attitude, an experimental attitude, which Fritz actually took on, which is why he was able to change his theory so much. And then, of course, his wife, who was a co-founder of Gestalt therapy, she actually was trained as a Gestalt psychologist. She did some of the trainings and things like that and helped his writings, but she was never given the credit that she deserved. So according to Gestalt, according to Pearls, there are 6 psychological factors that cause discomfort, things that cause psychological discomfort. And these are the reasons people come into counseling. One is a lack of contact or lack of social support. Contact is emotional intimacy with others. So you can be in a crowd but be alone, right? Confluence is when the environment takes control. So the person is not individualistic anymore. They're just reacting to the things that are going on in the environment. Unfinished business, and environment means other people, other things, literally anything that's going on outside the person. Unfinished business, which we use all the time now, is an inability to gain closure for whatever reason, maybe a relationship ending, Fritz would say, to close it out and to understand yourself in terms of what happened and then to release it. Fragmentation is when we have parts of self that we deny or fragment, and fragment of self, things that happen to us or emotions that we do not like. Does this sound familiar? So he pretended that he didn't want to be Freudian at all, but boy, he used a lot of this stuff, didn't he? Winner-loser is a conflict of values and expectations. So you're either right or you're wrong kind of thing. And that's when that conflict kind of stops us. It kind of prevents us from going anywhere. And then polarities, which is similar, is never seeing gray, always seeing black or white. I'm sure we all know somebody who just does not see shades of gray, that things either are or they aren't. A few words of terminology. I talked about contact. That's the ability to enter into a psychologically intimate and therapeutic relationship. It's an emotionally intimate relationship where you are your true self, but you also continue, you are emotionally intimate with somebody, but you continue to be your individual self at the same time. It's what we would consider healthy relationships now, right? Fusion is when you have a relationship with another person and there's no sense of separateness between the two. We also call that enmeshment. And then layers of neurosis, which are levels of contact that prevent psychological maturity. And these layers, Fritz said, are like peeling an onion. And there are 5 layers to that. And I will talk about those in the second podcast.